The early morning sun crept through the ancient trees surrounding Kensington Palace, casting faint, fragmented rays across the cold gray stone. The air was crisp, carrying the lingering mist of the night before. But this stillness was only a facade, much like the stoic grandeur of the stone statues guarding the palace gates. Here, every stone had borne witness to centuries of reverence, loyalty, and at times, moments of unforeseen trials. A crowd of tourists began to gather at the gates, their cheerful chatter and the rapid clicks of cameras blending into a lively, yet respectful atmosphere. They had come to witness the royal guards in their bright red uniforms and iconic bearskin hats, living symbols of enduring tradition and unwavering discipline. Among them stood Samuel Reed, as motionless as a marble statue, the morning light glinting off the row of medals adorning his chest. But behind that calm exterior lay a soul riddled with scars, not of the flesh, but of memories that refused to fade. Samuel was no ordinary guard. Before returning to stand at this post, he had fought in distant lands where the crack of gunfire replaced the morning alarm. He had lost his beloved brother in a brutal battle in Afghanistan, a loss no medal could ever mend. His deep blue eyes masked that pain well, but to the perceptive, there was something in his gaze that could not be easily hidden. In a far corner of the square, unnoticed by the crowd, a towering figure approached with heavy, deliberate steps, as if dragging a storm in his wake. Liam Grayson, a name whispered in the shadowy alleys of the city, where the laws were written in fists and blood. Tall and broad-shouldered, his scarred arms told tales of countless street brawls, their meaningless victories inked in crude tattoos snaking down his skin. But there was another scar, deeper than any etched on his flesh, a seething hatred for the military. Once, Liam had tried to enlist, dreaming of donning the same uniform Samuel now wore. But his rebellious nature and defiance had seen him rejected. That rejection festered into an obsession, breeding contempt for anyone who embodied the discipline and honor he could never attain. As Liam's cold gaze swept across the square and landed on Samuel, the immovable guard before the palace, a twisted smirk crept onto his angular face. He didn't just see a royal guard. He saw the embodiment of everything he despised and envied. And this morning, in the heart of the square, under the watchful eyes of hundreds, Liam Grayson decided he would teach that toy soldier a lesson in real strength. Or at least, that's what he believed. But what Liam didn't know was that real strength doesn't always lie in fists. And this serene morning at Kensington was about to witness a confrontation no one could have predicted, where steadfast resolve would collide with reckless pride, and painful past would rise to confront the present. Liam Grayson's footsteps echoed sharply against the ancient stone, shattering the respectful silence that hung before Kensington Palace. The crowd, lost in their souvenir snapshots, began to sense a shift in the air, an invisible tension creeping through, silencing laughter, halting cameras, and drawing curious eyes toward the brewing storm. Liam moved like a lone wolf, his piercing gaze sweeping through the crowd as if searching for prey. But none of the tourists were his target. His target stood tall at the palace gates, Samuel Reed. Samuel remained there, motionless, as if nothing were happening, yet acutely aware of the threat approaching. He didn't need to look to know. The instincts of a soldier who had faced war taught him to sense danger before it struck. But Samuel didn't move. He wasn't allowed to. Discipline was his armor, and he had learned to hide every emotion beneath it. Liam stopped just a few steps from Samuel, taking a deep breath. The stench of cheap beer and cigarettes filled his nostrils, mingling with the resentment boiling in his chest. Narrowing his eyes, he studied Samuel for a long moment. The bright red uniform, the medals glinting under the sun, the proud stance, and the unwavering gaze. Everything Liam hated and envied was standing right in front of him. He spat on the ground, the sound sharp and clear in the quiet air. "Hey, Scarecrow," he growled, his voice low and dripping with challenge. "What the hell are you doing standing here? Playing hero? Or just a puppet for the royals?" Samuel didn't react. Not a muscle in his face twitched, not a glance shifted toward Liam. He was used to provocation, to people testing his patience. But Liam wasn't like the others. There was something more dangerous in his voice. Not just provocation, but hatred. Liam stepped closer, close enough for his rancid breath to brush Samuel's face. "You hear me?" he snarled, clenching his fists so tightly his knuckles cracked. "Or are you just going to stand there like a coward?" Still no response. But it was that very silence that drove Liam mad. He wanted to see Samuel angry, to see him fight back. He needed it, because if Samuel reacted, it meant Liam had struck his pride. And if a soldier like Samuel could be dragged down with him, then everything Liam despised about himself would feel just a little less unbearable. Across the square, Anna Reed, Samuel's younger sister, was walking with her young son, Oliver, after their morning outing. When Anna spotted her brother among the guards, a soft smile flickered across her lips. But it quickly faded when she saw Liam. She could sense the danger in his every step, every gesture. "Mom, there's Uncle Sam," Oliver squealed, tugging at her hand, but Anna quickly pulled him close. Her eyes locked on Liam, recognizing something familiar. Not his face, but his demeanor. She had seen that look before, in hospitals when soldiers returned from the battlefield, carrying not just physical wounds, but ghosts in their souls. Liam wasn't a veteran, but his eyes were just as dark and hollow. Anna started to walk away, but her steps faltered when she saw Liam shove Samuel's shoulder. A small move, but loaded with blatant defiance. "You're no different from my brother," Liam roared, his voice cracking with rage. "I want to join the army like you bastards. But you rejected me. I wasn't good enough. Huh? Not disciplined enough?" He let out a harsh, rasping laugh that echoed across the square, sending chills through anyone who heard it. "You think you're better than me just because you've got those damn medals?" Samuel heard every word, each syllable like a dagger piercing his calm exterior. But he still didn't move. What he felt wasn't anger. It was pity. He saw that Liam wasn't just arrogant. He was a man tormented by his own failures, haunted by what he could never achieve. But Liam didn't need pity. He needed a rival. "You standing there because you think you're tougher than me?" Liam hissed, then suddenly yanked the bear fur hat off Samuel's head, knocking it out of its perfect position. That crossed the line. The crowd around them stirred, phones raised in the air, but no one dared to intervene. Samuel felt the simmering anger in his chest. He remembered his days in Afghanistan, when patience was the only thing keeping him alive. But here, under the watchful eyes of his sister and young nephew, he knew he had to hold his ground, at least until Liam truly crossed the final line. "You're a coward," Liam shouted, his fists clenching tight, the muscles in his arms standing out sharply. He had no patience left to wait. "Just stand there and watch me prove you're nothing but a puppet in uniform." And then, like a cornered animal, Liam readied his first punch. In that moment, Samuel knew the inevitable had arrived. But he also knew this punch wouldn't just be a clash between two men. It was a collision of arrogance and discipline, hatred and sacrifice. And in the end, the truth would be revealed through the fists of the one still standing. Liam Grayson's punch shot forward like a bullet, brutal, clumsy, but heavy with years of pent-up hatred. Time seemed to slow in that instant. Tourists held their breath, phones frozen midair, and every eye was fixed on a single point: Samuel Reed's calm face. The punch landed square on his cheek with enough force to drop an ordinary man. But Samuel only tilted his head slightly with the impact, his eyes unblinking. A thin line of crimson trickled from the corner of his mouth, stark against his pale skin and the crisp collar of his uniform. But he didn't step back. Not an inch. Liam staggered a step back, his hands trembling from adrenaline and something unfamiliar he didn't want to admit: uncertainty. He stared at Samuel, waiting for some reaction, rage, pain, even panic. But there was nothing, just that terrifying stillness, like the calm before a storm. You think you're tough, huh?" Liam growled, but his voice was starting to lose its edge. He couldn't understand why his punch hadn't worked. That punch had dropped bigger, meaner guys. But the soldier in front of him didn't even flinch. Samuel slowly turned his head back, his blue eyes finally shifting from the invisible distance to lock onto Liam. It wasn't the gaze of an ordinary guard. It was the gaze of a man who had seen death, who had survived the worst war could throw at him. It was a gaze that made Liam, the self-proclaimed king of the streets, feel smaller than he ever had before. Samuel said nothing for a few seconds, letting the silence seep into every crack of Liam's fragile confidence. And then his voice rang out, low, steady, and heavy as lead. "Is that all you've got?" That simple question echoed in Liam's mind, like a blow to his already crumbling pride. He gritted his teeth, trying to mask his confusion with a mocking grin. "You think you're tough just because you took one punch? A drop guy's bigger than you." He stepped back, bracing himself for a second punch, but this time, the swagger of an undefeated brawler was gone. In the distance, Anna Reed still stood there, clutching Oliver tightly to her chest. Her heart pounded, not out of fear for her brother. She knew Samuel could handle this, but she feared that her little boy would witness something he wasn't ready to understand: the brutality of people and the invisible scars it left behind. Oliver looked up at his mother, his wide, innocent eyes full of unshaken trust. "Uncle Sam's gonna be okay, right, Mom?" His innocent question made Anna's throat tighten. In that moment, Samuel's eyes met his sister's. A flicker of emotion passed between them. Not anger or fear, but a deep pain only family could recognize. He thought of his brother who had fallen in Afghanistan, of the promise he made to their mother before she died, that he would protect the family they had left. He knew he couldn't let this situation spiral out of control, not just because he was a royal guard, but because the people he loved were standing right there, watching everything unfold. Liam couldn't see any of that. His mind was clouded with hatred and the desperate need to prove himself. He couldn't comprehend the discipline Samuel was holding on to or why it mattered. To him, silence was a sign of weakness, and that made him even angrier. "I'll make you react, you bastard," Liam roared, swinging his fist again. But this time, Samuel didn't let the punch come close. With a movement as quick as lightning, yet still maintaining his composed stance, Samuel shifted to the side, dodging the blow. In that split second, he locked eyes with Liam, his voice cutting through the air like thunder on a clear day. "You don't know what real strength is." Liam stumbled forward as his punch missed its mark, throwing him off balance. He had never faced anyone who could evade his attacks so effortlessly. For the first time, fear crept into him, thin but unmistakable. He couldn't let himself fail in front of this crowd, couldn't bear the humiliation from a man he considered beneath him. "Don't think you're better than me just cause you wear that cheap uniform." Liam spat, his voice now laced not just with rage, but confusion. "You've got medals, you've got discipline, but you don't know a damn thing about the real world. I've been fighting my own war every day on these streets." Samuel heard those words, and he understood. He understood that Liam was the product of unhealed emotional scars, of failure and hatred festering until he couldn't tell friend from foe. But that didn't excuse his actions. Samuel had seen too many men like Liam in war zones. Men who couldn't face themselves and chose instead to blame the world. Samuel's eyes hardened. "The war you're talking about is the one you created to hide from your own fear." He took a small, deliberate step forward, his posture still rigid and formal. "But I've lived through real wars, where every day was a fight to keep myself and my brothers alive." Liam could feel the shift in the air. The crowd around them held their breath, and even the veterans nearby, men who had seen true warfare, recognized that this confrontation was no longer just about brute strength. This was a battle of wills, of memories, and unseen wounds. Samuel lowered his voice, just enough for Liam to hear. "You can hit me, but you'll never break me. And that's what scares you, isn't it?" Liam blinked, his fist tightening one last time. But now, he wasn't just trying to hit Samuel. He was trying to strike at a truth he couldn't accept. And that was the moment Liam realized he had already lost, even before the final punch was thrown. In that instant, Liam Grayson knew he had been defeated. But the truth was too bitter for him to swallow. He couldn't let himself be beaten in front of this crowd, in front of the people he had always dismissed as weak, as insignificant. His pride and hatred churned inside him like an uncontrollable storm. And with his reason drowned out, he clung to the only thing he'd ever trusted: violence. "All right, you goddamn soldier," Liam snarled, raising his fist once more. "Let's see how long you can last." This punch wasn't just physical force. It carried all the failures, bitterness, and hatred Liam had accumulated over the years. But it was exactly that weight that made his punch weak. His anger blurred his vision, slowed the movement of his muscles. What he didn't realize was that, while he was lost in the whirlwind of his emotions, the soldier standing before him was already prepared. Samuel Reed, with all the calm and discipline forged from years on the battlefield, didn't need to think twice. In the split second Liam charged at him, Samuel read every part of his movement. The way he clenched his fists, planted his feet, and the blind, seething rage in his eyes. This wasn't the punch of a warrior. It was the punch of a desperate man. And Samuel knew exactly what to do. In the span of a single breath, Samuel sidestepped Liam's clumsy strike. He didn't need to hit hard. Precision and speed were the keys. True strength wasn't in the outburst. It was in control. Samuel's right hand, still clad in a pristine white glove, swung like a razor-sharp blade. The punch came from his hip, not his shoulder, propelled by the solid grounding of his feet on the stone pavement. It landed with pinpoint accuracy on the weakest spot of Liam's face, right beneath the cheekbone, where the mandibular nerve ran directly to the central nervous system. Crack! The sound of impact sliced through the square like a whip cracking in the still air. No one had time to react before Liam was sent flying backward, his eyes bulging in shock and pain. Blood sprayed from his mouth like a burst pipe, mingling with shards of broken teeth scattering into the air. His large frame lost all balance, staggering like a puppet with its strings cut before collapsing onto the cold stone ground. The square fell silent. No one spoke. No one even dared to breathe too loudly. Phones remained raised in people's hands, but no one remembered they were recording. The crowd stood frozen, not because Samuel's punch was so powerful, but because it was perfect. This wasn't crude violence. It was the retribution of a man who truly understood what real strength was. Liam lay there, clutching at his now mangled face. He tried to open his mouth to curse, to fight back, but all that escaped were garbled groans, mixed with blood and spit dribbling from the corners of his lips. He wanted to get up, to prove he was still in control. But his legs wouldn't obey. Fear, the very emotion he had always mocked, now wrapped around him like an icy blanket. Samuel stood still, watching him for a few seconds, his blue eyes unwavering. He didn't feel triumphant. There was no smug satisfaction in his gaze. Only disappointment, not in himself, but in a man who had let hatred destroy everything he could have become. "You'll never understand," Samuel said, his voice low and steady, resonating in the silent square. "Strength isn't in the punch you throw. It's in knowing when you don't need to." At the corner of the square, Anna Reed clutched Oliver tightly, her eyes brimming with tears but glowing with pride. She knew her brother had done the right thing, not just defending his own honor and that of the military, but teaching that arrogant man a lesson in humility and discipline. Ethan Price, the old veteran, watched from a distance, nodding slowly. He understood better than anyone the difference between a true warrior and a man who only knew how to swing his fists. He'd seen plenty of men like Liam on the battlefield, those who thought violence was the answer to every problem, only to crumble when faced with the real power of resolve and discipline. Two police officers finally pushed through the crowd, approaching Liam. They didn't need to ask many questions. The situation was too clear to need explanations. One of them knelt to check on Liam's condition, while the other looked towards Samuel, his eyes filled with deep respect. "We'll need you to give a statement later," the officer said, his tone formal but unable to hide the admiration in his voice. "But this is clearly self-defense." Samuel gave a slight nod before returning to his post, standing guard as if nothing had happened. Only a small smear of blood on his white collar remained, the sole trace of the encounter that had just unfolded. Liam was dragged to his feet, staggering between two officers, blood streaming down his chin. He tried to resist, but no coherent words came out. Every time he opened his mouth, only garbled sounds escaped, mingled with the groans of a man who had lost everything. Not just his teeth, but the pride and arrogance he once thought untouchable. Before being taken away, Liam turned his head for one last look at Samuel. His eyes no longer held anger or hatred. All that was left was emptiness, a void of his own making, one he now had to live with. Samuel didn't look back. He stood there, poised under the morning sun, the embodiment of a simple yet profound truth. True strength doesn't come from fists, but from self-control and the courage to face oneself. And with each slow, faltering step, Liam Grayson, the man who once thought himself invincible, disappeared into the crowd, leaving behind a lesson he would never forget. The sound of Liam Grayson's footsteps echoed harshly against the ancient stone as the officers dragged him out of Kensington Square. Each step left dark red streaks on the gray pavement, indelible marks of a hard-learned lesson. He was no longer the cocky thug who had swaggered into the square that morning. Now he was just a staggering shadow, his mouth mumbling incoherent sounds, blood and saliva dripping onto his filthy tank top. Samuel Reed stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the horizon ahead. He didn't need to look at Liam to know the man had been defeated, not just by Samuel's punch, but by a truth he couldn't face. This wasn't the victory Samuel sought, but it was necessary to uphold honor and discipline, not just for himself, but for the soldiers beside him, and for everything he had lost on the battlefield. As the crowd began to disperse, Anna Reed approached slowly, still clutching Oliver. Her eyes were red, but not from fear or worry. It was a deep, emotional swell, laced with pride and a hint of sorrow. Oliver, still too young to fully grasp what had happened, looked up at his uncle with wide, curious eyes. "Uncle Sam, why weren't you angry? Why did you only hit him once?" Samuel crouched down, his gaze softening as he met his nephew's innocent face. He placed a firm, gentle hand on the boy's shoulder, his voice low but steady. "Because, Oliver," he said slowly, "strength isn't about how many times you hit or how hard. True strength is knowing when not to hit anymore." Oliver nodded, even if he didn't fully understand the weight of those words. But to Anna, Samuel's words echoed like a somber melody, reminding her of the brother she had lost, the one who had once told her the same thing. Samuel wasn't just speaking to Oliver. He was speaking to himself, to the memories and losses he carried with him every day. From the corner of the square, Ethan Price, the old war veteran, approached. His eyes gleamed with understanding and respect as he looked at Samuel. He had seen soldiers like Samuel before, men whose strength came not just from their bodies, but from the experiences and losses they had endured. He gave a slight nod, placing a hand on Samuel's shoulder. "You did the right thing, Samuel. Not everyone understands what true strength means, but you showed them." Samuel nodded in return. He didn't need praise. He just needed to know he had kept his promise to his fallen brother, that he wouldn't let hatred or anger control him. He had lost too much on the battlefield to believe violence was anything but a last resort. And even when he had to use it, he would do so with restraint and honor. In the distance, Liam Grayson was locked inside the police car. He sat silently in the back seat, his head resting against the cold glass window. Every time he tried to open his mouth to curse, to scream in humiliation, only muffled sounds came out, mingled with the blood and spit trickling from the corner of his mouth. His eyes stared blankly ahead, but in his mind, there was no trace of pride or strength left. All that remained was a cold emptiness. The realization that he had lost not just because of Samuel's punch, but because of an undeniable truth. He had never understood what real strength was. Liam had always thought strength was about making others afraid, using his fists to assert dominance. But now, sitting in that frigid police car, he realized that real strength was something he had never possessed: resolve, discipline, and respect for himself and others. He lightly touched his lower jaw, where shattered teeth still throbbed with pain. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the humiliation gnawing at him from within. He had believed himself invincible, convinced that no one could bring him down. But a single punch, just one punch from that soldier, had shattered all the illusions he'd clung to. He tried to recall the moment that punch landed on his face. It wasn't just the impact of flesh and bone. It was a collision between two worlds, one of blind hatred and one of sacrifice and honor. And in that moment, Liam realized he never stood a chance. Back at Kensington Square, the crowd had begun to disperse. But those who remained, the veterans, the tourists who had witnessed it, carried with them a story they would never forget. They had seen not just a confrontation between two men, but a lesson in strength, patience, and sacrifice. Samuel continued to stand at his post, his posture still formal and unmoving. But in his eyes now was something deeper. Not pride in victory, but the calm of knowing he had stayed true to himself. He had not let hatred dictate his actions, and that mattered more than any triumph. As the morning sun continued to shine down on the square, Liam's blood on the stone slowly dried, becoming faint traces of a lesson that could not be forgotten. But for Samuel and those who had witnessed it, that lesson would linger, a reminder that true strength doesn't lie in who you can defeat, but in how you control yourself when faced with adversity. And as the bells of Kensington Palace rang out, signaling the changing of the guard, Samuel stepped away from his post, leaving behind a square that had witnessed not just a clash of fists, but the victory of the human spirit over meaningless pride. The morning at Kensington Square gradually returned to its familiar rhythm. Tourists continued to stroll, cameras lifted once more, and light laughter echoed under the early sunlight. But for those who had witnessed the confrontation between Samuel Reed and Liam Grayson, the atmosphere here was no longer the same. Every stone in the square, every drop of blood that had seeped into the cold ground, told the story of an arrogant man subdued not just by a fist, but by a strength of spirit far beyond what he had ever understood. Samuel stood there, in his bright red uniform, with a small streak of blood still clinging to the knuckle of his white glove. His eyes no longer gazed blankly ahead. They quietly observed what remained after the encounter, not to seek validation or praise, but to remind himself that what had happened was an inseparable part of the duty he carried out every day. Anna Reed and Oliver still stood nearby. Oliver, his wide eyes full of curiosity, gazed at his uncle with deep respect, though he couldn't quite grasp the full weight of what he had just witnessed. "Uncle Sam," the boy asked softly, "why didn't you get angry when he hit you?" Samuel bent down, his eyes softening as they met his nephew's innocent gaze. "Because I don't need anger to protect myself, Oliver. Sometimes the strongest person is the one who knows when not to let anger take control." Anna listened quietly to those words, and in that moment, she understood more than ever the pain her brother had endured. Samuel wasn't just fighting men like Liam. He was battling the memories of the battlefield, the loss of a brother who never came home, a silent war only those who've lived it could ever truly comprehend. In the distance, Ethan Price, the old veteran, stood silently, his eyes following Samuel. He had seen many soldiers return from war bearing scars, not just on their bodies, but deep within their souls. But Samuel was different. He didn't let those scars define him. Instead, he turned them into strength to face the world each day, a quiet, unwavering strength. Liam Grayson, meanwhile, was no longer the arrogant thug who had strutted into the square that morning. As he was led into the back of the police car, he could feel the heavy weight of humiliation pressing down on his shoulders. It wasn't the defeat itself. Liam had lost fights before, but this was different. This time, he hadn't just lost a physical battle. He had been defeated in spirit. In that brief moment when Samuel's fist connected with him, Liam realized that everything he had believed in, violence, provocation, pride, were nothing more than hollow shells. He had never understood that true strength wasn't about making others fear you, but about controlling yourself in the face of hatred and anger. He had always thought life was a series of endless battles where the strong ruled over the weak. But now, sitting in the cold metal cage of the police car, he finally understood. The strongest person isn't the one who wins every fight, but the one who doesn't need to fight to prove their worth. Back in the square, Samuel felt the gazes of those around him, not looks of curiosity or admiration, but of understanding and respect. But that didn't matter to him. What mattered was that he had stayed true to what he believed in. Real strength, he thought, isn't about the hardest punch but about maintaining discipline and resolve when faced with challenges. Samuel knew life would test him again, not just with men like Liam, but with the memories and pain he carried inside. But he was ready, because he understood that every day he put on that uniform, he wasn't just protecting the royal family. He was protecting something greater: honor, discipline, and respect. As the clock struck the hour for the changing of the guard, Samuel walked away from his post, his posture straight, his gaze steady. The bloodstains on the stone would fade with time, but the lesson of strength and resolve he left behind would remain etched in the hearts of those who witnessed it. And somewhere, deep inside each of them, the story of the soldier who stood firm against hollow pride would live on as a reminder. True strength isn't in the ability to bring someone down, but in the ability to control oneself and act with honor and steadfastness.